Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI. On this week's episode, we're delving into the ongoing Israel-Iran conflict, which began on June 13th with a series of targeted Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, military assets, and key personnel. How is the government in Tehran responding? How do the Iranian people perceive the situation? And what does the escalatory spiral mean for the future of Iran's regime? To explore these questions and more, we're sitting down with Alex Vatanka, a senior fellow at MEI and the author of The Battle of the Ayatollahs in Iran, the United States, Foreign Policy, and Political Rivalry since 1979.
Our listeners can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And please do check out other podcasts from MEI as well, including Rethinking Democracy, hosted by Ginul Toll, and Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis.
Alex, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you back on the program.
Thank you, Matt. Good to be with you and Alistair.
We're recording this episode on June 17th. Who knows what may happen between now and when this episode airs. However, in the broadest of brushstrokes, can you tell us what's been going on so far?
Right. So, Matt, as you just said, we've been in this conflict now for about 4 days. We started with Israel striking Iran. Those strikes were limited mostly to nuclear sites, military sites, and the assassination of a number of Iranian nuclear scientists and members of the Revolutionary Guards. Where are we 4 days into the conflict? It seems, at least on the part of the Israelis, some of the targets have now expanded to include energy infrastructure and other assets of the regime, including yesterday, 16th of June, one of the main buildings belonging to the National Radio and TV was hit. And the day before that, a major gas facility in the Persian Gulf region was hit. Now, at the same time, the Israeli position is also maybe beginning to shift, going from we need to stop Iran's nuclear program to this regime has to go, can be trusted. All along, what Iran has done, at times it seems targeted. Some key assets have been hit in Israel, but at times it also seems very much indiscriminate in terms of civilians dying. So in terms of deaths, you got about 25, I think, the latest on the Israeli side, and about 10 times that, about 250 or so on the Iranian side. Multiple Iranian provinces have been impacted, mostly located on the western side of Iran, so where the Israeli planes are coming from. But at this moment, 4 days into the conflict, the regime in Tehran is still much intact despite the pressure that it's under. Israel is adamant that it will continue this for days, weeks, if necessary. And yet, on the sidelines, very important, the United States and others are suggesting perhaps there is a ceasefire to be had. Let me just wrap up with this point. No doubt in my mind that the Iranian regime would want to have a sort of resumption of diplomacy, even with the, I would argue, humiliation that they have suffered at the hands of Israel the last 4 days, but they know the survival of the regime is at stake. So they would take the option of going back to diplomacy, whether they will make the sort of concessions that Trump would want to see or Netanyahu would want to see. That's a different story. But for now, they definitely want to end this. They're not in a comfortable position, which, for me, raises the question, have they decided on the Iranian side to actually genuinely come up with the sort of things that might get Trump's attention, Netanyahu's attention, in terms of Iranian willingness to make bigger concessions, and whether it's too late for the Iranian regime, whether at this point we're down the path of regime change and there's nothing left for the Iranian regime to do to sort of, for now, to just survive as long as they can last.
So at this point, if I understand correctly, do you think the regime is unlikely to try to ratchet up its response or escalate militarily? It's just kind of batten down the hatches and try and weather the storm while saving face as best it can?
Two things, Alistair, on that. I ratchet it up. The big question mark is, can they? Do they have the tools in the toolbox? I mean, there are a finite number of ballistic missiles and drones that they have to bring to this fight. And let's not forget, they are alone. There's nobody on Iran's side. So Russia's not supplying them with anything. China, to best of our knowledge, is not supplying them with anything. They're on their own. Who are they confronted with? They're confronted with a country called Israel, backed by the entire Western bloc, the United States, Europe, everybody supplying Israel. So Israel can stay in this game for a long time, despite the fact that the Iranians are hitting their civilian areas, and that I'm sure has an impact on the morale on the part of the Israeli population. But if Israel leadership is willing to stay the course, they will have plenty of weaponry to play with, not so much on the Iranian side. But I would also say, to your point about, are they, ratcheting up, maybe expanding the conflict? This is my take on it. I sense no urgency on the part of Iran to make this into a regional war, because that's when it's most likely for the United States to enter the war. And that's the last thing the Iranian regime wants to see, because then it's a kind of done deal. Then there will be nothing left of the Islamic Republic. They will only regionalize the conflict, starting hitting refineries and U.S. bases in the region once they conclude. They haven't made that conclusion that the diplomacy for sure is dead and regime change is not on the agenda of just Netanyahu, but also of Washington. At that point, they got nothing to lose and they'll throw everything they have at anyone that they can reach.
We should point out that reports say that the Iranians have struck at least 2 refineries in Israel so far. Do you think they have the capacity to expand it beyond that? Is this just a warning shot?
So they did hit the refinery in Haifa and another one in the country. That came after Israel hit South Pars. So that was retaliation, I guess. But, we haven't seen Iran hit targets, energy or other critical infrastructure in sort of neighboring countries, the Gulf states and so on. And by the way, Matt, as you probably know, that made a lot of folks in Qatar nervous because, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, their facilities are so easy for Iran to reach. Again, I don't think the Iranians want to go there at this point, but that's the sort of thing they could do, similar to what Saddam did as he was pulling out of Kuwait. You remember the Persian Gulf War. Where you want to create as much mayhem as possible in the hope that you can get Trump's attention, right? Price of oil goes up to $200, $300 a barrel. That might get Trump's attention. But again, we're not there yet.
Alex, taking a look from a sort of historical perspective, how different is this conflict from what Iran has experienced before? And do you think its military commanders are kind of up to the job?
2 things I said. Number one is, let's not forget why we ended up here. Now, people can make the argument that what Israel did was unjust. This was not a preemptive strike that was justified. There's no evidence that the Iranians were about to weaponize. There was the general Israeli fear about the nature of this nuclear program, which is legitimate when you think about the rhetoric that the Islamic Republic has been engaged in against Israel for so long. But there was no imminent threat as such. I'll put that aside for a second. Why did Israel do what it did? Again, back to the rhetoric. Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, has engaged in this reckless ideological vendetta against Israel. And again, I'm not defending everything Israel does everywhere in terms of its regional foreign policy. But when it came to Iran, the Israelis could have been left out. Iran didn't have to have this fight. Khamenei wanted this fight. And he has spent the last 36 years obsessing about this issue, dragging the country through so much pain and agony, because this policy in Israel is one of the reasons Iran is isolated, certainly from the West, why it's sanctioned. So Iranian people have paid the price. And in the middle of all this, Khamenei has been under the illusion, it turns out, that we're so powerful, we're so strong. Let me just quote the man, there's not a damn thing they can do to us. And guess what? Within 4 days, they're waking up to the reality of a kind of warfare they've never seen before. So, Alistair, let's just put this in context. The leadership in the Islamic Republic, in terms of military affairs, they tend to be of the generation that fought another war from 1980 to 88 with Saddam Hussein. Entirely different war. And they're waking up to a warfare today that's about artificial intelligence. It's about air superiority. It's about electronic warfare. It's about the fact that they have turned their own people off to the extent that Mossad can go in and recruit anybody to carry out sabotage and so forth within Iranian society in a very different place. But let me also say this. If I was Israel, I wouldn't necessarily assume that the people of Iran will rise up tomorrow against the regime. That is a question mark for me. They hate the regime. Majority of people do genuinely, and I don't use the word hate lightly, but they don't like the regime. But, for Netanyahu to assume people are going to come to the streets tomorrow and fight on behalf of Israel, that's a huge if as well.
One of the kind of starkest things I think that we've seen from the start of this campaign is the degree to which Israel has clearly been able to deeply penetrate the military and security apparatus in Iran. How do you think it was able to do that, and why is Iran proven so weak at counterintelligence?
I think that's the sort of thing Iranian officials would like to know the answer to. They have
Sure they would.
known the problem. Again, we can always go back to one of the most famous statements made in this regard by former Iranian Minister of Intelligence, who said in a public speech a few years back, Mossad has infiltrated Iran so badly that every single politician, official in this country ought to fear for their lives. That's a few years ago. And just last summer, we all remember the Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated in a hotel room, in a guest room in downtown Tehran. So this is hardly news. The question is, why didn't they do better job at minimizing or reducing to the extent possible the Mossad penetration of the regime? A couple of things come at it. Mossad has the resources and has the determination to penetrate, whereas Iran has been, in rhetoric, very much anti-Israel. In practice, they haven't really necessarily focused on the job, right? You certainly haven't seen Iranian intelligence assassinating anybody inside Israel. They just don't have that capacity. It shows you quite a bit of where their investment and focus has been. But I would also say this, Alistair, which I think is very important, that when you spend 46 years alienating your own public from yourself, you are allowing outsiders like Mossad to have a point of entry because they can tap into that Iranian anger against the regime and recruit people.
This question of regime change has come up a lot since the latest upsurge in the conflict has started. People have pointed to the name of the Israeli operation. Netanyahu has said certain things which also lead people to believe that either the mission has expanded to include this, or maybe that was the Israeli goal from the very start. You've alluded to it as well. Would it be fair to say that given what the Israelis have accomplished so far, we're already seeing kind of a soft regime change in the sense that many of these top IRGC commanders, top military leaders were taken out in the first couple days. These were people very connected to Khamenei. They were there since the very beginning of the revolution. And with the need to replace them with second, third generation personnel, are we seeing a transmutation of the Iranian regime before our very eyes?
Could very well be the case because, Matt, here's the thing. If you're able to infiltrate the system the way the Israelis have done, if you're able to go into a place like the capital of your chief adversary and fire missiles from point A to point B within the city without having to come in from outside, it just shows you the extent of infiltration. Then the question to ask is, of those people who have been presumably collaborating with Mossad, how many of you might be willing to accept the fact that this country needs a new leadership? It's time to change teams. I assume that's true for a lot of folks who are thinking about their own survival. But I would also say this. Again, Israel's never done this before. Israel's had lots of wars that it's engaged in since its creation in 1948, but it's never gone into a country, certainly nothing like the size of Iran, and gone in and able to sort of change the society, if you will. But the way they have carried out their operations the last few days and the way they have cultivated Iranian opposition over the years raises the question of maybe there is a plan here. Maybe once the Israeli Air Force stops bombing, suddenly we'll be faced with an Iranian opposition that operates in diaspora and emerges from the ashes, if you will, from within Iran and says, we need to now work together for the sake of continuity of this country as a country to go from Islamic Republic to something else. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody has thought about that. In fact, I would be surprised if somebody hadn't thought about that, somebody meaning Israel. But again, it's a major undertaking. Israel's never done it before. And for it to succeed, I assume they're banking somewhere along the lines for US and the Europeans and others to join them in that endeavor.
One quick follow-up for you. What does this say, or what do we know about who is now advising Khamenei, and how is that potentially going to change the Iranian calculation, the Iranian activities?
Khamenei obviously is in hiding. He has always had an inner circle. He has always also at the same time, wanted to have a debate. So the Iranian regime is not one where Khamenei sort of decides this is what we do and we do it. There is a culture of debating the various strategic options that the regime collectively faces. I think that more or less probably still there. I mean, when you look at the Supreme National Security Council, most of those members 2 dozen or so that sit there based on the latest we have are alive. Who is gone? Most of the ones that are gone are most notably Hossein Salami, the head of the Revolutionary Guards and so on. So, a bunch of the senior military folks or those in uniform from the Revolutionary Guards have been killed. And notice this, the Israelis haven't gone after the senior members even of the regular armed forces. They've gone for the Revolutionary Guards, the ideological part of the regime. That's quite telling. But my point is, so you might actually have, if that debate continues, more of a sort of energy coming from the so-called technocrats of the regime, who most likely are going to be the pragmatic ones calling for ceasefire, calling for ending this, as opposed to the Revolutionary Guards and the more ideological elements who for so long have believed their own slogans about we're going to fight the Americans and the Israelis. But there are many of those are dead or assuming right now busy firing off missiles. So they're not speculating, but maybe they're not the dominant voices in that debate about the day after.
I'm going to turn now, Alex, to look at how Iranian society kind of writ large has responded to these strikes. Has the sort of initial shock turned to a rally round the flag effect, or is the population sitting on the sidelines to see if the regime survives?
So it's obviously early days in a war that could last for a long time and a war that could be devastating. I mean, if this is a war that sort of wraps up in a few days, I think the consensus would be in Iranian society that this was a war that could have been avoided. Then again, regardless of whether Israel was justified in attacking Iran, not the context is important. That Iranian ideological propaganda against Israel, and not just propaganda, and practical support for groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and so on, forced this situation on Iran. But if this war continues for a longer period of time, if we start seeing dead Iranian civilians, which by the way is something the Iranian regime is investing a lot of time on national TV, showing what they call the crimes of the Israelis, killing innocent Iranians. If that situation continues for a protracted period of time, who knows whether the people rallying around the flag sort of moment arrives. Right now, we're not there. Right now, people are still focused on why on earth did we get ourselves into a war that could have been avoided. But if the war continues, that might shift, and that will make life harder for anybody who is hoping for, regime change. Yeah.
Are we seeing any signs so far that the government is preparing to or already quelling potential popular dissent? Are there any differences on that front between, say, major cities and more rural or minority areas in the country?
We don't have a very good sense of that. I mean, the reporting on that would be very limited for obvious reasons. So those of us sitting outside, but we have already seen attempts to, for example, don't video and post anything on your social media account of the damage of Israeli strikes. So trying to keep the spirit of the nation up, that not everything is lost. Iran's going to come out of it. So there are a lot of references to the Iran-Iraq war. We've gone through this before. We fought the Iraqis for 8 years. We were alone then. We're alone now. But the problem is this is not the Iran-Iraq war. This is not a ground war. This is a very different type of war. And the Israelis are coming from 1,000 kilometers away and hitting them in ways they couldn't imagine. So the intensity of this war is so different. During the Iran-Iraq war, which I remember because I was a child in Tehran, you had moments where the Iraqi Air Force were suddenly above your skies and we had to run for the shelters. But those attacks occurred over the course of 8 years. But the intensity of what is happening right now is in a different league. And I suspect that's going to be a major factor in terms of shaping public perceptions. But to your point about what the regime is doing, they clearly want to keep those people who are questioning all those fundamentals that we've talked about, they want to keep them silent to the extent possible.
Alex, you're currently in the process of writing a book on Iranian-Arab relations. We're seeing that the Gulf Arab states in particular have been trying, if not to sit out the war, at the very least to push the United States especially to try to bring it to a close as fast as possible. To what degree do you think that represents somewhat of a return on investment for Iran with the diplomatic overtures that they've done toward these countries in the past several years?
So the Iranians, for a long time, really had a policy of describing, particularly Gulf states, what they call the Arab sheikdoms, describing the worst terms possible. That these were lackeys of the United States, and they'll be swept away because they don't matter. They don't have the backbone to stand up to what the Iranian regime's sort of standard ideological propaganda calls imperialist America taking advantage of the Middle East. So that's the history of the Islamic Republic. But in the last few years, to your point, Matt, they've invested in those same countries that they for so long taunted. Why? Because they realize actually those countries like Saudi Arabia, like UAE, like Qatar, Oman, and so on, they could actually be, if you will, interlocutors or mediators with Washington. That they could pick up the phone and call Trump and say, can you please tell your friend Bibi Netanyahu to stop attacking Iran? Because the Iranians are telling us they're going to attack us if this thing gets out of control. So suddenly they've become a potential tool, if you will, in Iran's overall sort of strategy. The Gulf states, from their point of view, have one key objective, which is to stay out of this fight. They have billions and billions and trillions of dollars of investments that they're worried about. They don't want to get caught in the fire. I would also say this. Obviously, just before we came in to record this conversation, Masoud Pezeshkian, the president of Iran, spoke to Mohammed bin Zayed, the president of the United Arab Emirates. So those conversations are happening. Are they having an impact? I'm not so sure. They're probably playing a role, but I think the fundamental policy fight right now to be had, or two of them. One is in the inner Trump circle between the ones who want to take this war and finish it by finishing the Islamic Republic and those who are saying, sir, you got elected on the promise of no more Middle Eastern conflicts, and now we're just about to sleepwalk into one. I don't know who's going to win that policy debate. But I do think the Gulf states, from what I can tell, are going to be very careful not to get dragged in. They will do what they can to mediate. But if regime change happened in Iran and they didn't have to pay any price for it, I'm not sure if they're going to feel that bad about it the day after. Although there will be a lesson here that regime change can happen to even some of the more powerful ones in the region. So everybody should be on their guards.
Looking at other, kind of key actors in this whole equation, Washington obviously is a really central one, and the question of whether or not they'll get actively involved in the hostilities. So far, Iran seems to be calibrating its response and specifically avoiding targeting U.S. interests to prevent the full entry of the U.S. into this conflict. What might it take for Tehran to change its calculus on that front? And do you think we're likely to see the U.S. get more directly involved?
Actually, that was the other point I wanted to mention earlier. I described one, the debate among the sort of inner circle of Trump. The other policy fight is Netanyahu-Trump. So, my suspicion is that obviously President Trump at this point is very clear, knew that the Israelis were about to strike Iran. He knew that. He must have green-lighted that. But did he sign off for regime change in Iran? That's a whole different story. And I suspect there's no clarity on that. Certainly right now we don't. Much will depend on events in Iran. If evidence shows that the regime is on the brink of collapsing, then it's very easy to imagine that President Trump wants to be on the winning side and said, I brought this about. If it's not about to collapse and it's going to turn into something of a quagmire of sorts, then President Trump's going to hesitate because that's where it's going to be, requiring U.S. involvement. And so I think that's where the Iranian officials are at right now. They don't know if regime change is going to be the direction where U.S. and Israel are going to go, because if that was the case, I suspect, to your point about what's going to get hit and so on, I suspect that's the point where they're going to try and regionalize this. Well, in terms of bringing as many actors into it by, for example, attacking facilities in the Gulf states and so forth, or U.S. bases in the region. They haven't done it because there is that faint hope, or maybe more than just a faint hope, that there will be offer from President Trump for a diplomatic solution, and that this time around Iran should take that seriously, and that could be a way out for Iran out of this conflict.
One other question that I think a lot of people are thinking about is what's the likelihood that Tehran decides they should just go hell for leather on developing a nuclear weapon at this point? What's your kind of read on the conversations in Tehran around that?
I mean, that is very much something that they're threatening with. The Majlis, I think yesterday, just voted on, Iran leaving the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's more symbolic. That's just aimed to pressure the US, the Europeans to think about the potential outcome here if Iran. But can you realistically imagine Iran building a weapon while under fire? Difficult for me to see. They could do that, but the risk obviously is that US intelligence or Israeli intelligence other pick up on it. And then that kind of gives the reason that, Israel presumably wanted to have to say to the United States, it's time for you to enter this conflict directly and not let us do the fighting alone. Again, that's not a pretty place for the Islamic Republic to be.
Alex, we've covered a lot of ground here, but before we wrap up, just want to get your kind of outlook, where you see things going from here. What might an end to this conflict look like, and what do you think that could mean for the Islamic Republic?
Alistair, I don't know. I mean, to the last point there, the latter part of what you just asked me, there might not be an Islamic Republic before we know it. I didn't expect to sit here and have this conversation with you a week ago, right? We at the Middle East Institute went to Oman twice earlier this year. All we focused on was diplomacy. And the Omanis were telling us how things were working out. And here we are in a very different place. So it's extremely difficult to predict. But a couple of things I know. One is the nuclear issue. Even if there is a decision to have a ceasefire, Iran and its leaders surely by now know that just agreeing to a number of centrifuges they're going to take away and so on is not going to cut it. It's the nature of the regime that has to make compromises. It's the political message that comes from Tehran. That's why we're having this conflict, because it's seen as a threat. We don't sit here and talk about the Pakistani actual nuclear weapon. We're talking about the Iranian potential to have nuclear weapon. Why? Because the Iranian leadership made the strategic mistake of being so loudmouth about all the things that we're going to do to Israel in the US and so forth, and they're paying the consequences as a result today.
That's all the time we've got for this week. Thank you, Alex, for joining us on the program today, and to our listeners for tuning in. And finally, a big thank you as well to our production team for all of their work on this week's episode.
To find MEI's latest coverage of the Israel-Iran conflict and defense and security issues across the Middle East, please visit our website, www.mei.edu. You can also follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events.
I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj. We hope you'll listen in again next week.